It was discovered at that time Terry Bollea, also known as Hulk Hogan, was experiencing a serious medical-related issue. Personnel provided medical treatment at that time and transported Mr. Bollea to Morton Plant Hospital, where he died at 11:17 a.m.
When the news broke on the morning of July 24, 2025, it traveled across the world in seconds. Hulk Hogan, the man who had spent 4 decades making arenas shake with noise, was gone. The wrestling legend, whose real name was Terry Gene Bollea, had died at his home in Clearwater, Florida, at the age of 71. For millions of fans who grew up watching him tear off his yellow shirt, point to the crowd, and slam giants onto the canvas, it felt like a chapter of their own lives had closed. But within hours of the official announcement, a different kind of conversation had already begun. One that would take nearly a full year to fully resolve. One that would pull investigators into the private corners of a very famous man's very complicated life. The death itself was not in dispute. Emergency personnel had responded to a 911 call reporting cardiac arrest at Hogan's Clearwater Beach residence. His wife, Skydaly Hogan, had made that call herself, telling a dispatcher that her husband did not appear to be breathing. An occupational therapist named Justin McCamey and a home health aide named Dana Swinton were also present in the home at the time. McCamey and Swinton had briefly stepped away to prepare the bathroom for a therapy session. When they returned approximately 10 minutes later, McCamey immediately sensed that something was wrong. He would later tell investigators that Hogan's supplemental oxygen equipment had gone silent, and he could no longer hear the wrestler breathing. McCamey checked for a pulse and found none. Together, the 3 people in that room moved Hogan to the floor, and McCamey began performing CPR while Sky called emergency services. Clearwater Fire and Rescue arrived within minutes and took over life-saving efforts. Paramedics connected Hogan to a cardiac monitor and found that he was in asystole, a complete absence of cardiac activity. He was transported to Morton Plant Hospital, approximately 3 miles from his home. Despite 45 minutes of continued medical efforts, doctors at Morton Plant were unable to revive him. At 11:17 in the morning, Hulk Hogan was officially pronounced dead. The Pinellas County Medical Examiner later confirmed the cause of death as acute myocardial infarction, more commonly known as a heart attack. His manner of death was ruled natural. For many people, that should have been where the story ended. But it was not where the story ended. In the hours and days following Hogan's death, details emerged that complicated the straightforward narrative of a sick man whose body had finally given out. Much of this began with Justin McCamey, the occupational therapist who had been present that morning. In his initial conversation with responding officers, McCamey raised a concern that would ripple through the investigation for months. He told police that he believed Hogan may have been the victim of medical malpractice. Specifically, he suggested that a surgeon might have damaged Hogan's phrenic nerve during a major spinal operation that had taken place roughly 10 weeks before his death. That surgery had been significant. On May 14, 2025, Hogan had undergone a 4-level anterior cervical discectomy and fusion, a highly complex procedure in which damaged discs in the cervical spine are removed and nearby vertebrae are fused together to restore stability and relieve pressure on spinal nerves. For a patient in their early 70s who had already undergone more than 24 surgical procedures over the course of a professional wrestling career, the risks involved were considerable. The phrenic nerve, which controls the diaphragm and therefore controls breathing, runs close to the surgical field in cervical spine operations. If that nerve is compromised, a patient can experience sudden and serious respiratory failure, sometimes weeks or even months after the procedure itself. McCamey's suggestion sent investigators down a careful path of medical review. But it would later become clear that his concern, while understandable given what he had witnessed, was not grounded in direct medical knowledge. During a follow-up interview with investigators, McCamey clarified that he was not a specialist in surgery or neurology and that his initial statement had been based on information he had heard secondhand rather than anything he had personally observed. This clarification was important. It did not eliminate the question of whether the surgery had played a role, but it did change the weight of that question considerably. To understand what investigators were actually dealing with, it is necessary to understand the condition Hogan's body was in when he died. The details that emerged through the investigation and through official medical records painted a picture that was far more serious than the public had known. Hogan had been battling chronic lymphocytic leukemia, a form of cancer affecting the blood and bone marrow. He had begun chemotherapy treatment in the period leading up to his death. He also had a documented history of atrial fibrillation, a condition characterized by irregular and often rapid heartbeat that significantly increases the risk of stroke and cardiac events. His wife told investigators that Hogan had not only undergone the major neck surgery in May, but had also recently had a heart valve procedure. A manager connected to Hogan told investigators that he had recently begun receiving dialysis as well. Taken together, these facts describe a man who was not simply aging, but who was managing multiple serious and overlapping medical conditions simultaneously. According to the final police report, medical records obtained from Morton Plant Hospital, Tampa General Hospital, and Good Samaritan Medical Center all showed extended hospitalizations and declining health in the months preceding his death. The report noted no indications of criminality and no evidence of surgical complications that could be attributed to wrongdoing. On August 16, 2025, Hogan's own family arranged for a private autopsy to be conducted. That independent examination reached the same conclusion as the official findings, stating that there were no reasonable traumatic or terminal toxicological contributions to his death. In other words, no poison, no trauma, and nothing that suggested another person had caused or accelerated what had happened. The private autopsy confirmed what the medical examiner had already stated. Hogan's heart had simply stopped. Given this medical clarity, why did the investigation continue for nearly 12 months? The answer lies partly in the public nature of the man involved, and partly in the genuine questions that surfaced in the immediate aftermath that investigators had a professional obligation to address before closing the case. Clearwater Police acknowledged openly in their final statement, released on June 5, 2026, that the extended investigation had been driven by the need to address, challenge, or validate the concerns that emerged following Hogan's death. They reviewed recordings, conducted witness interviews, examined home surveillance footage, and obtained access to extensive medical records. The family cooperated fully. Sky Daly Hogan, along with Hogan's children Nick and Brooke and their attorney Kevin Haslett, allowed investigators access to deeply personal information during an extraordinarily difficult period. The Clearwater Police Department specifically thanked them in its public statement, noting that the family's cooperation had been essential to completing the review. The 72-page investigative report that accompanied the department's announcement on June 5, 2026, was unusually detailed. Police said they were releasing the full file because of what they described as extraordinary public interest in Hogan's death. The document covered every significant aspect of the case, from the minute-by-minute account of events on the morning of July 24th to the review of medical histories and witness statements. It also addressed the specific questions that had circulated online and in the media, including the theory about phrenic nerve damage and the speculation about possible foul play. The report concluded unambiguously that there was no evidence to indicate anything other than a natural death and no evidence of any criminal wrongdoing. What made the investigation more layered than a typical natural death case was not any single piece of suspicious evidence, but rather the complicated personal circumstances that surrounded Hogan's final months. Investigators, as they always do in high-profile cases, examined those circumstances carefully even when the medical picture was relatively clear. Hogan's personal life had never been simple. His first marriage to Linda Claridge, which began in 1983 and lasted more than 2 decades, ended in a highly publicized divorce in 2007 after reports of infidelity became public. The separation was financially and emotionally damaging. Hogan later spoke openly in interviews about the depression he experienced during that period and admitted that he had experienced suicidal thoughts. He married Jennifer McDaniel in 2010, and that marriage quietly ended in 2021. In 2023, he wed Sky Daly, a yoga instructor and wellness practitioner whose influence he credited with bringing stability and focus into his later years. He described her as someone who had helped him find genuine peace through meditation, clean eating, and a calmer daily rhythm. His relationship with his daughter Brooke had been strained for years. The tensions had been worsened by the public scandals that had attached themselves to Hogan's name, including a widely covered leaked recording that had damaged both his reputation and his family relationships. Brooke had not attended his wedding to Sky and had remained largely distant from family events in the years that followed. Despite this distance, Clearwater Police noted in their final report that both Nick and Brooke cooperated with the investigation through their attorney. The department thanked both children by name in its closing statement. Financial details also received attention, as they typically do in any case involving a high-profile death. Hogan's estate, while not the multi-million-dollar fortune some had imagined given the scale of his fame, represented the accumulated value of a career that had genuinely transformed an industry. Reports indicated that his son Nick had been named as a primary beneficiary. Brooks' relationship with the estate was a reflection of the estrangement between father and daughter, a sad but ultimately private family matter, rather than anything that pointed toward suspicious circumstances. The 72-page report and the witness accounts it contained offered the most detailed picture yet of Hogan's condition in the period leading up to July 24th. His occupational therapist McCamey told police that when he had completed his initial evaluation of Hogan the week before his death, he had been genuinely surprised that the wrestler had made it through that week at all. This was not a statement about foul play. It was a statement about how seriously ill Hogan had been. The man who had appeared in photographs smiling and seemingly strong had been, behind the scenes, in a state of serious medical decline that those closest to him had kept private. Sky Daily Hogan's account to investigators was consistent with this picture. She described a husband who had been focused on recovery and who had approached his health challenges with the same determination he had brought to everything else in his life. But the leukemia, the chemotherapy, the heart condition, the neck surgery, the heart valve procedure, and the dialysis had all placed an enormous cumulative burden on a body that had already absorbed decades of professional punishment. The morning of July 24th was not a sudden, inexplicable event. In medical terms, it was the outcome of a convergence of serious conditions that had been building for months. The home surveillance footage reviewed by investigators showed nothing that contradicted these facts. No signs of intruders. No evidence of tampering. No indication that anyone had entered the home without authorization or had done anything that could be connected to Hogan's death. The footage, combined with the medical records and the testimony of everyone present, told a consistent and coherent story. While the police investigation moved through its methodical process, Hogan's family pursued their own form of accountability on a separate track. In September 2025, according to Pinellas County Court documents, the family filed a petition to extend the statute of limitations for a potential medical malpractice investigation. This legal move was not an accusation but a protective step that preserved their right to pursue further inquiry if the evidence eventually warranted it. Sky Daily Hogan had publicly indicated that the question of whether the May spinal surgery had played some role in Hogan's death remained something the family wanted to understand. This was an entirely understandable response from people who had watched someone they loved die, while also knowing that he had recently undergone a high-risk medical procedure. The desire to know whether the surgery contributed, even in some indirect way, to what happened is the kind of question that any family might want answered. But the medical records reviewed by the police investigators, drawn from 3 separate hospitals, did not support the conclusion that surgical error or phrenic nerve damage had been a determining factor. The private autopsy that the family themselves had commissioned reached the same conclusion. The malpractice exploration remains a private legal matter for the family to pursue or set aside as they see fit. What the official record shows is that the public investigation, conducted exhaustively and transparently, found nothing criminal and nothing that contradicted the medical examiner's original determination. It would be impossible to discuss this case without acknowledging the storm of speculation that surrounded Hogan's death from the very first hours after the news broke. Online platforms filled almost immediately with theories. A radio personality had told his audience in the weeks following Hogan's surgery that the wrestler was in critical condition and might not survive, setting the stage for an atmosphere of rumor and conjecture. When Hogan died, that atmosphere did not dissipate. It intensified. Claims circulated about hidden rooms, disabled security systems, mysterious phone calls, and secret files. Stories spread about FBI agents uncovering disturbing materials inside the mansion. Each new rumor built on the last, creating a parallel narrative that bore little resemblance to what investigators were actually finding. The reality documented in the 72-page police report was far more human and far more heartbreaking than any conspiracy. A seriously ill 71-year-old man, surrounded by people who cared for him, had experienced cardiac arrest while receiving home health care. 3 people had done everything in their power to save his life. Paramedics had arrived quickly and continued those efforts all the way to the hospital. None of it was enough. This gap between the factual record and the mythology that grew around it says something important about how famous people die in the modern world. When someone as large as Hulk Hogan passes, there is a powerful collective desire for the ending to match the scale of a life. A heart attack, however devastating to those who loved him, can feel somehow insufficient as an ending for a man who once body-slammed a giant in front of 90,000 people. And so other stories emerged to fill the space that grief opens up. On June 5, 2026, the Clearwater Police Department officially closed its investigation. The case was classified as an attended natural death. No criminal charges. No foul play. No evidence of any wrongdoing of any kind. The department released the full report publicly in recognition of the enormous public interest in the case, and the document stood as a comprehensive and transparent accounting of everything investigators had found and everything they had ruled out. Hulk Hogan's career did not need the amplification of mystery to justify the scale of its impact. He had been one of the first true global wrestling stars, a performer whose charisma and physical presence had helped carry professional wrestling out of regional territories and into living rooms around the world. His matches during the 1980s and early 1990s were not merely sporting events. They were cultural moments. His rivalry with Andre the Giant, culminating in the famous body slam at WrestleMania 3 before a crowd of over 90,000 in Pontiac, Michigan, remains one of the defining spectacles in sports entertainment history. Wrestlers and entertainers who came after him, many of whom became household names in their own right, have consistently pointed to Hogan as someone who helped build the stage they would eventually stand on. He transformed the business of professional wrestling, attracted mainstream sponsors, brought the sport into primetime television, and proved that a wrestler could become a genuine crossover celebrity. He appeared in films, had his own reality television series, and built a recognizable brand that extended far beyond the ring. Whatever complications existed in his personal life, and they were real and they were significant, they did not diminish the scale of what he had built professionally. In Clearwater, murals bearing his likeness remain on the walls of local buildings. Fans continue to gather in places connected to his life and share stories of the impact he had on them. The yellow bandana, the torn shirt, the pointing finger, and the roar of a crowd responding to him are images and sounds that live in the memories of an entire generation. The full account of Hulk Hogan's death, now documented in official investigative files and confirmed through multiple independent medical reviews, is one of physical decline meeting a body that had simply been pushed beyond what it could sustain. The leukemia, the chemotherapy, the atrial fibrillation, the heart valve surgery, the neck fusion, the dialysis. Each of these alone would have represented a serious burden. Together, they created conditions in which cardiac arrest was not an unlikely outcome but a medically foreseeable one. His occupational therapist's candid statement to police, that he had been surprised Hogan made it through the week before his death, was not a clue pointing towards something sinister. It was a medical professional's honest assessment of how serious the situation had already been. Sky Hogan's 911 call, the immediate response of trained medical personnel, the private autopsy, the hospital records, and the final 72-page report all point to the same conclusion. This was a natural death. A painful one, certainly. A premature one, in the sense that no death at 71 feels like enough time when the person was someone of his magnitude. But a natural one. The investigation is closed. The record is clear. And the story of Hulk Hogan, the story that will last, is not the story of how he died. It is the story of what he built across 4 decades of one of the most demanding careers in the history of entertainment. That story belongs entirely to him.